Am I audible now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Sorry, we're having a little a run-in with all the technical issues here. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me here. A very, very warm welcome to all of you. I shall be speaking about the paradox of education in Muslim minority educational institutions in India based on my ethnographic work in 5 cities. The presentation will be divided into 4 parts. I will begin with highlighting the constitutional mandate, which is what's responsible for the existence of these institutions that dates back to the 1940s. I will go on to highlight the educational disadvantage that Muslim minorities face in India. And then the second part of the presentation will weave together narratives of students from minority institutions in 5 states, universities in Delhi, Hyderabad, and degree colleges in Bhopal, Ranchi, and Uttar Pradesh, to highlight why students opt for higher education in Muslim minority education institutions. The paper essentially argues that education in these institutions emerges as a paradoxical resource. It offers different forms of circumscribed agency to the participating students. On one hand, the education in these institutions expands the aspirational horizons of the students, but on the other hand, they find that their opportunities for employment and mobility are restricted due to a larger landscape of social political marginalization. In the end, the paper will touch upon the distinction between how policy views educational marginalization of Muslims and the insights that are emerging from the field, and how it sort of compounds the processes of educational exclusion of Muslims. So the Constitution of India grants all minorities, whether based on religion or language, the right to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. These rights come under the overarching position. The slide will just be on for you to see that, under the overarching umbrella of cultural and educational rights of minorities in India, under Article 29 and 30. Definitionally, the institutions, the Muslim minority, so the minority educational institutions are for all the recognized minorities, religious and linguistic, but I shall be confining myself to the institutions set up by Muslims as a religious minority. So definitionally, these institutions are ones that are established and managed by members of the religious or minority community, in my case, the Muslims, and are meant to serve the educational interests of their community of belonging. They are an important means to create educational opportunity, protection of language, culture, inclusion, and empowerment. When the debates in the Constituent Assembly back in 1948 were taking place on the importance of these safeguards, B.R. Ambedkar, in his summarization of the importance of minority educational institutions, said that it is very important that these are read as non-discriminatory clauses. One, that the state cannot discriminate against these educational establishments founded and run by linguistic and religious minorities. And second, there can be no discrimination in granting any recognition or aid or assistance from these to these institutions by the government just because of their minority status. He also talked about the fact that the vision with which these special articles are included as fundamental rights is to ensure inclusion, so that these institutions not only serve the minority, but in fact all other students, provided that it is not obligatory for students not belonging to the minority religion to join in any of the classes on religion. So Muslim minorities, like all other minorities in India, have extensively drawn on these provisions to establish educational institutions of all shades and varieties. This includes schools, it includes universities, it includes professional colleges, it includes ITIs, polytechnics, and madrasas. As one of India's most educationally backward community, there is absolutely no denying the importance of these provisions and special protection for Muslims. The two government reports, the Sachar Committee report in 2006 and the Kundu Committee report in 2014, have highlighted the educational disadvantage that the community faces. The community has one of the lowest literacy rates. It has a high percentage of students who've never attended school, one of the lowest mean years of schooling, and the highest dropouts amongst all social religious categories. With the rate of dropout increasing at every level of education. In fact, if you look at the higher education scenario, we find that the most recent All India survey of higher education shows that Muslim enrollment has actually declined from 5.4 to 4.6%. And this decline can be seen across all the institutions, all the different forms of institutions, whether it's central universities, public funded state universities, self-financed universities, colleges, institutions of national eminence. So this decline has been across the board in all forms of minority educational institutions. And this stands in stark contrast to other groups whose enrollment has actually increased. So there are 2 points to note here, that one, the participation of Muslims in higher education is 4%, way below their proportion in the population, which is 13%. And second, that in the last 2 years, the participation of Muslims in higher education has actually declined, which stands in stark contrast to other marginalized communities, such as scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. So this was the larger context in which I carried out my ethnographic work in attempting to understand that what is it that makes Muslim minority educational institutions a popular choice amongst the students, and then what is the possibility that it offers students to address their own socioeconomic marginalization. So field narratives highlight that there are multiple reasons why which members of the community opt for these institutions. What I have done is that in the slides, I have picked out some of the narratives from my field and put them for you to read there. And in my presentation, I will sort of contextualize that how I have made sense of these narratives in the field. So one of the biggest reasons is, of course, affordability. The parents repeatedly talked about, as you can see from the statement that I've cited from Bijnor, which is a small Kasbah town in Uttar Pradesh, that, we prefer this institution because it takes staggered fees, accommodating the fact that in a rural credit-based economy, the money only comes in after the agricultural season is over. So this sort of accommodation and flexibility makes minority institutions affordable for a large segment of society. And if you look at the larger national context, affordability is a big issue because Muslims constitute one of the most impoverished groups in India. The same government reports that I cited earlier, the Sachar Committee and Kundu Committee reports, have highlighted how poverty levels of Muslims are in rural areas are higher than the national average. So the flexibility in payment and the low fees with good facilities is one of the reasons for opting for these institutions. One of the second reasons that were cited by the parents and the students who I spoke to was in terms of accessibility. these institutions, so for example, I put in a statement of one of the parents who said that, I am a tailor and I studied till class 7th. My boys are working very hard, but given the competition in India today, even 90% is not good enough. So I admitted, or I'm trying to admit my children in Jamia because at least there is 50% reservation there, and they can get through their desired disciplines like engineering and so on and so forth. Similarly, some of the institutions have a quota in terms of the fact that they admit internal students, people who've done their schooling from minority institutions, because a lot of these minority institutions run schools, colleges, polytechnics, women degree colleges, there's an entire ecosystem that runs. So there is movement possible within this. So Muslim minority institutions were seen as achievable owing to this relaxation of norms in terms of cutoff and so on and so forth. The other point that emerged from a lot of the students was that that these institutions are familial, and this was demonstrated by the use of a very common Hindustani word called mahal, that, there is this ethos that these places have. It's an acha mahal. Now that literally would translate into a good ethos, but it is important to sort of understand what this good ethos means. What it meant was that what it sort of came across from the accounts of the parents was that the social cultural ethos of the institutions is an extension of the family and community. So they use words like rehen sehen, the way you live and talk, the way you dress, the fact that there's a weekly break for prayers during Ramzan, the timings are different. So this seemed like an extension of the home and the community. Also, the good atmosphere included a stress on discipline and character building, which extended far beyond curriculum. A lot of parents compared minority institutions with other colleges, saying that one of the most important things is that these institutions prevent our children from being corrupted. There is no gali galoj, which is basically abuses. There is no chakkarbazi, which means these sort of premarital affairs that boys and girls have with each other. No avaragardi, like loafing, and there's a lot of emphasis on good manners. So this seemed like an important concern for the parents. Another concern was, could we go back to the earlier slide? Yeah, was that these institutions are accountable. There's a term that the parents often used in terms of jawabdari, which basically means accountability. That if something is not right, if there are no studies happening, if something goes wrong, at least we have someone to approach, someone who we can talk to, someone we can access, which they felt was something that they couldn't in other institutions. I particularly like the way these institutions, the parents talked about the aspirational value of these institutions, because when I was conducting my interviews, they would turn around and tell me that, for us, for people in rural UP and Bihar and Mewat, this is like going to Oxford and Cambridge. And that always made me smile. A lot of the institutions, the premier institutions amongst minority and educational institutions like Aligarh Muslim University, Jamia, Maulana Azad Urdu University are seen as aspirational destinations for students coming from the rural hinterland, and especially for first generational learners to break into elite Muslim circles. And of course, the very fact that they are also ranked highly as national universities is something that really helps. The sort of personal relationship that the teachers fostered in these institutions was seen as opportunities by a lot of the parents. So, for example, parents would often tell me that they never even knew that there was an option like pharmacy or physiotherapy or home science or hotel management that even existed. But it is owing to the network of minority educational institutions that the teachers would be like, okay, so if for whatever reasons you cannot access a medical degree or something which is very tough to get in, why don't you look at, pursuing this sort of a course in a nearby institution? Another big reason that emerged from the parents' narratives and the students' narratives was the entire concern around safety. And this was particularly true in the case of girls, where the students and the parents shared that at times when there is extreme insecurity because of the sort of political insecurity that exists, these institutions are seen as safe spaces, again, on account of the sort of extension of family and community. A word that was often cited was that even though our children are far away, we have tasalli, like, we are comfortable in the thought that they're safe there. And this was very, very important to the parents. For girls, minority institutions, in addition with all these factors, attend to concerns about fostering appropriate aspirations of a proximity, and again, an extension of the family and community in terms of security, because parents had real concerns while they were willing to educate their daughters, but the daughters should not be educated too much. Too much means where they are questioning the place of women in their domestic roles, where they are sort of looking at intercaste or even worse, interreligious marriages. And so these were seen as very dangerous situations that came up with girls pursuing higher education. So minority education institutions in that way offered the best of both worlds, because while they offered higher education, but the chances of these dangers was limited. So just to sort of sum it up, for the parents, minority educational institutions are seen as protective, safe, affordable, accessible spaces with a Muslim ethos that offers students quality education and also the promise of accessing good jobs and improving social status. It is particularly seen as an important pathway by the aspirational middle classes to pursue their dream of participating in India's new economy and stake their claim on equality and dignity. In Lawrence Gautier's recent work on Jamia and AMU, she points out that how the rise of the Muslim middle class in the 60s and 80s in India corresponded with a sharp rise in minority educational institutions for higher education. With this, I would like to move to the second part of my presentation. So what happens when the students actually reach their aspirational destinations? This is which brings me to the larger argument about how these institutions emerge as a paradoxical resource. I traced the students' experiences in some of the institutions through interviews with the final master's students and doctoral students, and also interviewed some of the university and department placement cell student coordinators and teacher coordinators to find, to get a better sense of what were the aspirations of the students, what were the sort of job options and career pathways that they were exploring, and how did this transition from higher education into actual work happen. And what came up and what emerged was that actually the students' journeys are mediated by a range of factors. At the micro level, by the individual and familial circumstances. At a meso level, by the learning and peer group experiences that they have in these institutions themselves. And at a macro level, by the larger reality of the socioeconomic marginalization that Muslims face in India. At each of these levels, there's a discernible tension between the possibilities and the constraints. This is something that I felt is coming out strongly from the narratives. So on one hand, the very access and the presence of a lot of the students in these educational institutions and higher education opens possibilities of employment and access to positions of power and influence. I draw on Appadurai's capacity to aspire to argue that the students find an expansion in their aspirational horizons. As Muslim students, mostly first generational learners, when they join education settings, they gain from the exposure, the access to information, the peer interaction, the quality teaching and the hand holding. So like you can see that in one of the narratives that I have put on the slides, that one of the PhD scholars talked about the fact that, my family had a wood business in Saharanpur, and it was like a sort of a given that I'll be taking over this business. And I just thought I need a degree. So I joined the BA program. And but once I actually went into university and I stayed in the hostel, I realized that, probably I joined a couple of other societies like debating and so on and so forth. And I realized that I can make an argument, I can think, I can convince people. When the CA protests broke out, I joined these protests, and he was given the task of handling the social media. This sort of affirmed his belief in the fact that, he had something, that his thought process had validity. And now he's pursuing a PhD on Pasmanda Muslims, which is the lower caste backward Muslims in India. And he says that I can just not ever go back to being that quiet, apolitical, person who was just a businessman sitting on a shop. I mean, I just don't have that personality anymore. I think differently. I act differently. And he said that this is something that Jamia has given me. So, this is the sort of expansion that we are talking about. For women graduate students, often it is, getting and respectable jobs, things that have approval, that have acceptability, places where they're allowed to work alongside economic independence. Higher education also allows students, it equips them with the knowledge and vocabulary to question, even their own standing in society. That is there discrimination and exclusion of Muslims going on? Question things that are happening, participation in student activism, and in general, the sort of knowledge, applying the knowledge that they're learning in the classroom to their own lives. So definitely access to higher education opens all these pathways. But what eventually happens when they sort of step outside the university, it's like, you're dressed and ready with nowhere to go. It reminds me of this sort of thing that they find their aspirational horizons widened, but the opportunities for employment and mobility are restricted because of a larger context of marginalization. And how does this, I was very interested in sort of working my way through that. How does this translate into everyday life? How does this larger context of marginalization percolate, into everyday lives of people? And some of the themes that I feel that are emerging from my work are the ones that I've mentioned on the slide. The first is the inability to access dominant social networks. So, could we have the next slide? This particularly came out in the sort of conversations with the student coordinators of the placement cells, where they said that, we understand that unemployment is bad all across India. It's a national election issue. But it's really, really bad for Muslim institutions because placement is really down. It's not even 30%. And this 30% is also drawing on our alumni networks, curated over the years. And then another concern that emerged was, which was at an intersection of religion and caste and class, and gender, actually, that where people said that, even within this small pool, all the good jobs are taken by people who are from private schools, who speak good English, who know how to present themselves. So it's that they get there first, and actually the people who need the jobs the most are not able to access these opportunities. So there was a lot of frustration, there was a lot of disappointment that they could not translate this advantage of higher education into salaried employment. so Bourdieu's concept of social capital is very sort of something which is very at play here, where a lot of students said that they do not have the social capital in terms of accessing networks which secure good jobs, a decent salary, or social status. And this is something that we can also corroborate with the sort of reports on employment that come in from a national level. So the most recent periodic labor force survey of 2022 has found that only 15% of 15 years plus Muslim students are engaged in regular jobs, vis-a-vis 23% non-Muslims. And even these jobs are concentrated in low-paying self-employment options. So, but this sort of narratives give us a sense that how this is playing out. It's not because of it's just the difficulties and the real barriers that students face in moving from higher education into actual employment. The students, of course, turn to the university structures such as placement cells for support. But the Muslim minority educational institutions are themselves marginalized in the larger ecosystem of India because of this minority tag. If you could have the next slide. Yeah. So this minority tag often means that they are perceived, the educational institutions themselves are perceived as predominantly only catering to Muslims. If you would recall that in the first slide, I had pointed out that one of the provisions which underlay the basis of these institutions was inclusion and equality, wherein there was a mandate that actually these institutions would be open to the students coming from non-minority backgrounds. However, this minority tag means that they're sort of stereotyped as only Muslim institutions. And I think this minority tag is something that is very which is sort of repeatedly came out in the sort of narratives that came from the students, where they talked about that once you actually get out of the bubble of these institutions, you realize the world outside is just very, very different. So another PhD scholar from Jamia, who was a JRF, he topped in his bachelor's and master's, and he said that I actually chose to study in Jamia, even though I had offers from several mainstream universities, because I felt that it was here that I found my calling. I realized my academic potential. But now I realize that this place is a bubble. Because when I gave interviews for academic posts, he's qualified as NET and JRF, they asked me my views on Ghazwa-e-Hind, which has no correlation to my PhD on climate change. Ghazwa-e-Hind is, hadiths, and for those of you who know, hadiths wherein the Prophet, which where that there'll be an Islamic army that will invade the Indian subcontinent. So it's a very sort of prejudiced, attacking, and definitely inappropriate question to be raised in a job interview. And so this sort of, he sort of narrated this experience. Then the student placement cell coordinators talked about that, we are often given the feedback that our students are not, you really need to be a little more professional. And the word professional means that, the students need to play down their Muslimness. They make too much of a fuss about, the dress, particularly the headscarf, that will they be allowed or not allowed, and then the Friday prayers. So the students' narratives of this sort of, getting into the job market highlighted that how their very education in the minority educational institutions gets implicated in the process of stereotyping and discrimination. The negative stereotypes associated with the Muslim minority institutions leads their degrees, which could be a degree in BTech, it could be a degree in management, it could be a degree in social work, as sort of inferior to other competitive places. Students revealed that how this was revealed in the lack of pay parity. If you notice the last statement that I've put, this is from my own department in Jamia where I teach. One of the state rural livelihood missions, which is a government position, openly offers a lower salary to MSW graduates from Jamia vis-a-vis Delhi University and TIS and some of the other places. And there is just no explanation for it. It's the same degree. And in fact, Jamia has a better ranking on the national scale. So the students are sort of witnessing this, encountering this day in and day out. And, they sort of shared this in the interviews. Now, what this does is that this creates a sort of a double bind situation, on one hand, there are concerns regarding safety, security, and a lot of the other things that I shared lead students to opt for Muslim minority institutions. On the other hand, their very education in these institutions restricts, further mobility, or allowing them to realize the aspirations that they had, from higher education to this transition into the job market. The education for these students emerges as a paradoxical resource. It offers a circumscribed agency. Agency, yes, owing to an expansion of horizons, an increase in abilities, pursuing career paths which are very different from the sort of background and jobs of their parents. So it definitely raises aspirations and opens possibilities. But there is there's a sort of boundary, like this far and no further, where there is a restricted access to jobs and careers. And these pathways continue to draw on community networks and resources. So this is something that strongly emerges from the field. And I will move to the last part of my presentation, wherein now, how does policy sort of view this? How does the higher education policy view this, address this? This sort of understanding that is emerging from the field is completely absent in the higher education policy discourse. The education lag of Muslims, which is widely acknowledged in all the statistics that I shared with you in the earlier slides, is definitely there. But then how is it explained? It is explained by emphasizing religious and cultural factors that are internal to the community, rather than social economic marginalization. This includes citing religious conservatism and social cultural ethos, conservative gender norms, and the fact that it's the community, the community only wants to stay with its own people. So they opt for identity-based community institutions, such as madrasas and minority educational institutions. Now, overtly, the policy states, very overtly states, and ostensibly has this commitment to educational equality. But when you talk about how does it choose to address this sort of educational marginalization, it offers mainstreaming into higher and technical educational options. But what are the incentives for this mainstreaming that it offers? And there is where we see a complete disjunction between what the policy says and what the policy does. And a very good example of this is the sort of steep decline in minority scholarships in recent years. In 2002, and I'm just stating this as an example, I mean, there are numerous examples in terms of the sort of budgetary decline of the Ministry of Minority Affairs, the recruitment policy, and so on and so forth, the sort of budgetary allocations that are made to a lot of these institutions, the very fact that these institutions are constantly embroiled in cases in court. But I'm not going to go there. I'm going to sort of focus as an example on the decline in scholarships. And I think you will. This would be a little illustrative in this regard. So in November 2022, the government cancelled 2 scholarships for minority students. One was the pre-metric scholarship from class 1 to 8 for students belonging to minority communities. And the second was the Maulana Azad National Fellowship, which gave a 5-year financial assistance to MPhil and PhD students to pursue higher education. Between 2019 and 22, 6 educational schemes, the spending on 6 educational schemes declined, and so did the number of beneficiaries. One of the recent reports, the recent 2023 report by the Center for Budget and Governance Accountability, highlights that these scholarships were inflicted with serious implementation issues. There was poor coverage of beneficiaries. Out of, say, 1 crore applicants, only less than half were given benefits of the scholarships. And the utilization of the budget often happened in the last year, last quarter of the year. So the scholarship money was disbursed. So the entire academic year is over and it's disbursed towards the end. All of which, sort of point to serious problems. And in addition with this, the amount of the scholarship was not revised from 2007 to 2008. So for example, the pre-metric scholarship, which was actually disbanded, gave 1,000 rupees per annum, which is 83 rupees per month. I mean, it's less than £1 a month, because the pound I recently converted is 106 rupees. So it's less than £1 a month, and this was withdrawn for overlaps. So, I mean, I think this is illustrative. What it actually does, to sum up where I am, and I would really like to hear your feedback and your thoughts, is that it creates a sort of vicious cycle where policy measures are insufficient to address the factors that limit the access of Muslims to mainstream educational institutions. So, there's a larger political climate where access is difficult. The support expected from policy or the incentives expected from policy are not coming through. And this leads Muslim youth to excessively rely on minority educational institutions for education and community networks for employment, creating a sort of vicious cycle, of stereotyping, marginalization, and exclusion. So it's almost a form of exclusionary inclusion. So there's inclusion in policy, but it's creating new forms of exclusion and marginalization. And I think I'll stop here. And, very happy to take questions, comments.
Great, thank you very much. Well done, and it's very nice to be able to give you a round of applause. I'm going to watch questions online, but this is our first question in the room, please.
Yes.
I'm really impressed by the how you have put all together, and I'm really impressed by how you have kept your research very independent from politics, because I think we South Asians can relate to the concept that how minorities are being used as vote bank, and it actually, I think, contributes to this vicious cycle that we are talking about, because policy, politics, employment, and sometimes studies are also very much related to politics. But yes, it's a mind-blowing, it is mind-blowing that how you have managed to sort of keep politics aside and just researching in the literary terms. My question is, I know that it may not be it may not be related to the things that you are working on, because I am from Bangladesh, and I know that in educational institutions, for example, we have religious institutions, madrasa, and I think in Bangladesh, we only have madrasas for girls and for boys. Other than that, for higher education, we do not have particular institutions assigned for minorities, because in Bangladesh, we are minority, like Hindus are minority,
Right.
Christians and Buddhists are minorities. So we do not have that kind of educational institutions. And I wanted to understand that fact, that minority institution and religious institutions, the difference or the relation between these two, because I wasn't clear about that. That's my personal question. And another thing is, I think right now there are so many things happening in India, because I was just watching the news, and maybe there is some kind of survey which happened in recently, where it shows that the minority community, the number of minorities has been increased.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Census.
Yes, so I have seen that.
Was it the caste census or the population survey?
Population
Yeah,
survey.
yeah, yeah.
So the minorities.
But they've presented it
Yeah.
very wrongly. In fact,
Wrongly, maybe because
yeah,
of the election
yeah,
that is going to happen. Yeah, so having said that, and also I have seen in somewhere like the OBC policies, I think the I think quotas or the things that for the backward section, the privileges that has been given. How do you relate the current situation with your studies?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I could take probably a few more, or should I address this?
It's up to you. We have got questions
Okay.
Mohammed, Azad, do you want to ask a question about the timing of the research? Mohammed Azad? And if not, we can just pose that question, you can answer that question, and Professor Berger is going to ask a question.
Hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very clear, crystal clear presentation. The one message, implicit message, which you did not make it explicit, I draw from your presentation is that the minority students studying in the minority institutions have poorer network and in a disadvantageous position when compared with minority students studying in non-minority institutions. That implicitly, when you talk about the network, marginalization, etc., this you did not state, but
Yes.
that is what I can infer as a researcher from what you presented.
Okay.
Now, the counter question that I am asking is that, what about the non-minority students studying in the minority institutions? Will they also have the same branding or labeling like this, or this is only confined to the minority students studying the minority institutions? Am I clear?
Yes, absolutely. I get the question.
This is, you did not state, but if I infer from the research that you have done, extensive research that you have done, it gives perhaps a wrong message. So I just wanted to be clear from your side what exactly you mean by that.
Sure. So I'll address both the questions. I'll take yours first. So my research was on, I've sort of interviewed students from studying in minority educational institutions. I have had a couple of focus group discussions which included non-minority students. But in terms of the sort of conversations we had with the placement coordinator, they said that the minority tag, for example, in universities like Jamia, in AMU, in Manu, sort of stretches to, there's a sort of understanding that these degrees are not equivalent. They're in some way inferior to the ones that are in non-minority colleges. So, but when a student is Muslim and from a minority institution, I think the two get sort of wedded together. It's sort of compounded. In the case of non-Muslim students or non-minority students from these institutions, there is only only the tag is there, about the institutions having,
Intersectionality.
Yeah, exactly. Now, on the second, the inference that you drew about what happens to minority students studying in non-minority spaces? Do they actually, that you inferred that they have better access to networks? But, AI did not interview those students, which I think is a little bit of a blind spot. So you've given me something to think about. But what I can say is that even in their case, my intelligent guess would be that the first part, where the tag of belonging to a minority community still stays. So I'm not very sure in terms of whether studying in a non-minority institution allows them access to the same networks that non-minority students studying in those institutions will have. I think they would still be subordinate or at a disadvantage. But this is again something that I'm intelligently guessing, because I've actually not interviewed minority students in say universities which are non-minority institutions. So that is something that I would like to say here. To your question, so my default was actually on madrasas. So I think that I can offer some insights on that. In fact, for this research, a lot of the reasons why I chose to embark on this research, which is still ongoing, is because of the sort of conversations I had with people when I would present my insights on the madrasa work. Because madrasas are also minority institutions. But the moment you use the word madrasa, it sort of has all these other connotations, of sort of, securitization and anti-national and just religion. And so they actually, in terms of a lot of the times, madrasas are not even seen as educational institutions, even though that's what they primarily are. Oh, there's also a role of pop culture. Okay.
That's all they're shown in India versus Pakistan movies.
Okay.
There's going to be a terrorist coming out of a madrasa.
Okay.
So that's also how that.
There's the imagery, the stereotypical imagery which is built. So in fact, one of the reasons, because a lot of the insights that emerge are actually similar. It's just that they are more amplified in the case of madrasas, because of all the other connotations that are there. But I think one of the things that stood out for me in my research was that the minority educational institutions Muslim minority educational institutions make a very strong distinction from madrasas, to say that, we're not a madrasa. We offer BTech, we offer secular education, only the ethos, only the informal curriculum, which is a very small, minuscule part of the entire education project in these universities, is used to sort of stereotype us. We cannot be equated with madrasas. So that's one thing. In terms of the larger politics, see, again and again, I have repeatedly emphasized the fact that there is this entire narrative that's going on, that's sort of this Islamophobic narrative. It's not only in India, but it's across the world. But in India, you see a particular variety of it. And this is the reflection, a lot of things get implicated in that. And what I've tried to show is that how education, employment, pathways get implicated in this. So just the policy itself, right? The policy says that, okay, yes, Muslims are educationally backward, but the reason why they're backward is because of religious and cultural factors. Okay, but what are the solutions that it's offering? The solution, if you look at any policy document, because I've done a policy analysis from 1940s to the 2000s, every scheme in the last 20 years, there's been a shift which talks about madrasa modernization, increasing access to Muslim minority institutions across for all religions, skill training and vocational training. There is very limited in terms of, even though the reports, the Sachar Committee report and the Kundu Committee report talked about equal opportunities, talked about the fact that Muslims show a clear preference for government institutions, non-minority institutions, not madrasas. But where is the opening of these possibilities? So we don't find that resonance in policy. So there's a sort of a disconnect. Yeah. Okay, sure.
Dennis, you want to come forward and ask a question? Dennis, Sami?
Hello. Can I come in again?
I was gonna ask him first, but if you come in again if you want to, that's fine. Okay, any minutes. So his question was about what constitutes a minority group in India. Contexts, as opposed to numbers, I keep it mind. And then, we also had Shruti Ahuja. Do you want to ask a question? And then Professor Gaze.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, so I couldn't hear you clearly, David. Should I come in now or am I in the queue?
Please do.
Okay. Thanks a lot for a wonderful and a clear presentation. And I think you've been absolutely deservedly complimented earlier too on it. So thanks a lot, Haim. My question is, I think as a world citizen, I won't even identify with a particular country and humanism. I'm just trying to understand, and I know this is going a little beyond, but I'm trying to link it to education, and that could be a starting point. Where do the madrasas have a role and the curriculum has a role? The curriculum specifically has a role in creating the marginalization itself. Because if the narrative externally is, and it was very interesting the point you made that these secular, these other minority higher education institutions make it a point to assert their distance from the madrasa, though they all belong to the same community, saying we are secular, then that means by default they are implying that the madrasas are not. And the statement is coming from that own community institution, right? It's not coming from any other institution. So is there a role that the curriculum of the madrasas is playing in this marginalization? And how does any countries, besides India, I don't know if there are other, combined ethnicities where madrasas are there. How does one work to actually modernize along with the community themselves? Because if there's a resistance within the community and they feel that a big part of their identity, and it could be a religious identity, which is fine, but when most people now have a secular leaning, then to say a majority of the young children are being given a religious identity for the next 12 years. And I haven't understood madrasas, but I want to lean on your understanding of it to just clarify this for me.
This is a very tough question. It takes me back to my PhD days. So I would like to say 2-3 things here. One, that madrasas have a very long history in the subcontinent, okay? And they have constantly adapted. So the word madrasa itself means like a school, a place to go and study. But over time, as I mentioned earlier, that their meaning has sort of gotten distorted, and this comes with a huge, don't want to get into the details, but the colonial legacy where it was felt that, we need to protect the sphere of education. So, let's confine it to religion. Now, over time, what has happened is that this confinement to religion has become a cause of concern. And one of the sort of policy measures and the processes and what we often talk about and what you also mentioned is this entire thing of madrasa modernization that has come into being. What I found out in my DPhil, I taught in a madrasa, a girls' madrasa for like over a year, that a lot of madrasas, like for example, the largest network of madrasas in India, the Deoband, has voluntarily adopted for, integrating a secular, not a secular or whatever, mainstream, like a regular school curriculum that happens in other schools, along with the sort of teaching. And even in the place where I taught, the prayers and the religious education is something that happens alongside modern education, which is not to say that there aren't madrasas which only impart purely religious teaching, but I'm saying that madrasas, again, are of all shades and varieties. The argument that the madrasas put forth is that we have a specific purpose. Our purpose is to train people in the religious and secular sphere. Why are we such a cause of concern to the rest of the ecosystem? The argument of the parents is that as Muslims, we need dini and dunyavi talim, like we need religious and secular education. These are institutions that offer us both. They're affordable, they're community institutions. We find them accessible. This is a preference for us. And the argument of the policy is that these are the hubs that explain educational backwardness of Muslims. These are again tie up with the fact that Muslims always opt and prioritize religious cultural factors. These are problem arrangements, and they need to be addressed. And the solution is madrasa modernization. Now, the two things again that I will say is, one is the scale. Only 4%, the Sachar committee found that only 4% of children actually go to madrasas in India. And second, the fact is, what does madrasa modernization even mean when, when all the 96%, which is accessing all the other educational spheres, are experiencing the sort of issues that I pointed out earlier. So what I'm trying to say is here that we sort of see religious education and secular education as something which are binaries. But for a lot of people in the community, what I realized when I was doing my interviews with parents and students who go to madrasas is that this is something that goes hand in hand. But that also makes me answer the question that you asked, that, oh, you made an interesting observation, but, here it is Muslim minority educational institutions who are saying that, oh, we are not madrasas. Again, it is how, the way everybody else perceives us also greatly impacts the way we perceive ourselves, right? So you're saying that there's this minority tag, but but minority tag is a lesser evil than the madrasa tag. You know what I'm trying to say? They're all gradations, but they're on the same spectrum. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I've answered your question. I don't really have any clear answers, like in terms of watertight answers.
So that's good. I think it's really important. It's a relational stigmatization going on.
Yeah.
Self-policing as well as an external discourse that's framing and limiting. I mean, using their own, well, but we've got three last comments.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Yes.
Professor Gabe again, and then Yusuf, and then Dita. I'm afraid we've got 5 minutes left. So
Okay. Okay.
The field debate in England echoes the things that you find.
Really?
That's very interesting.
Oh, that is very interesting.
yes, we must talk about that more. But,
Yeah.
yes, please. The last question online, Professor Gabe, please. Do you want to come in again?
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, I could not understand. It is not a question, it's just a comment.
Yes.
A large share of the comments that you made about the tag that is associated with the minority institutions is not applicable to Christian minority institutions in India.
Correct. Correct.
And if you say that you have an English medium education from a Christian school in India, it adds your prestige and a premium in the labor market.
Absolutely.
Not as a minority tag that you find in the Muslim cases. So therefore, my request to you too, one, when you make this statement, it should be very clearly, you have mentioned it, I'm repeating what you mentioned, is applicable more to the Muslim minority institutions. This has a lot to do with how Muslims are treated, not only their minority institutions, how Muslims are treated in a society.
Yes.
The second part, if you are extending your study, it may be better to have some focus group discussions in Christian educational institutions, because you find that a larger share of Hindus are going to Christian minority institutions. There is no taboo. Even if you take the political leaders in India, those who speak against minorities, you find that many of them have degrees from Christian minority English medium schools.
No,
So I
absolutely.
just wanted, so it is not a question. I'm just making this as a comment,
No, that is actually very good. You've made me think that probably the word minority tag, which I sort of felt was a Muslim minority tag, I only use minority. So that's very insightful. And yes, absolutely, I agree with you that in fact, Christian institutions are seen as aspirational.
Yes.
Uh, uh, in fact, the cases that have been filed, like for example, St. Stephen's College case that was fought in the Supreme Court, was about why are we not actually admitting more students from non-minorities? So it's clearly seen as something which is very desired and aspirational. Even schools, yeah, absolutely. I agree with that comment, and thank you for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Yes, please.
Hello.
Come in.
Hello.
Hi.
Your presentation was very insightful. I just want to raise a comment.
Yes, please.
There is one study by a Jamia PhD student. In the year 2012, I think. So I think PhD thesis has been already submitted. Saima Iqbal, indicating that Muslims are significantly underrepresented in government universities, particularly in North India. Maybe around 1 to 3% in government universities in North India. However, the percentage is slightly higher in South India. For example, in South India, the study indicates that it's around 13% in general universities.
Okay.
So furthermore, our enrollment in higher education is lower overall. Even our government surveys indicate the same. Higher Muslims, particularly Muslim minorities. Nonetheless, there is a higher concentration of Muslim students in minority institutions such as AMU and Jamia due to their minority status. We get 50% reservation.
Precisely.
So, yeah. So minority status in this sense is beneficial in terms of enrollment of Muslim minorities.
No, definitely it's beneficial. And that's what I'm saying, that in terms of when people talked about accessibility, they definitely talked about these sort of benefits. But what I tried to sort of highlight through my presentation is that once you have this benefit, the community members want to avail this benefit for certain reasons, which then they are not able to. Which leads to disappointment and frustration despite high performance and despite like all the universities you mentioned, AMU, Jamia, they're also very highly ranked in the national rankings. Jamia is number 3, all India, AMU is number 7. So, they're also highly ranked. So it's the own rankings are sort of seen as what should I say, subordinate to the stereotype that that is prevailing about these institutions. But I'll definitely look at the PhD that you mentioned. Thank you.
Sure. And one more thing, it's about madrasas. It's not just about 4 to 5% of students in these madrasas. There are more than 25,000 madrasas in UP, Bihar, and all this. This is the government data I'm saying. So primarily located in North India. So we can offer the modernization means at least a basic schooling up to 12th standard. Modernization of madrasa means according to me, maybe government schemes have these giving computers and all those things. But basically it should be along with the religious education, we should provide at least basic schooling up to 10th or 12th standard.
Right.
Thank you very much. We really ought to wrap up now. One very last question about concealment from Nandita. Do you want to ask a question, Nandita?
Yeah, thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Hem, for such a wonderful presentation. I think highly enlightened. I just have actually one comment and one curiosity in terms of a question in terms of being curious. One is that I was just wondering whether when you're talking about placement of such students, I was wondering if these students have been placed as teachers or academic staff in higher educational institutions. Because some studies have proved that even in other than if you talk about general public sector in higher education institutions, there is a lost generation of students who have not really translated into becoming teachers. And there is a lot of work on that. So I was wondering, even in cases of minority education institutions, in the way that you put it, are these students getting employed later on in either minority educational institutions as teachers, or maybe in some other higher education institutions as teachers? Is that option at all open for them? I don't know whether they've seen it or not. If not, it's just my curiosity. One was this. And the second is, I thank Professor Verghese also for bringing this whole point of, Christian minority institutions vis-a-vis Muslim minority institutions, and the Christian institutions being much more aspirational, as you pointed out very rightly. So that also makes me think in terms of, the larger discourse of the new middle class, new Indian middle class, if I should so call it. Are students from these minority education institutions, it just seemed to me, this is a comment that I'm just wanting to make, that it seemed to me that when you're talking about their interviews, in terms of jobs and all of that, that their socio-cultural, especially their Muslim identities, have to be concealed as if, to be able to enter into this new Indian middle class.
Yeah.
And this whole, the larger discourse of then, who is the Indian, and whether the Muslim is Indian enough in terms of being able to become smart enough, as you said, in terms of concealing their dress as not being, Indian enough. So the larger political discourse of how we look at Muslims as a minority, and and therefore the whole point that you were raising about secular and religious no more being binary identities as to what is secular is also defined in the same discourse, because we tend to define secular in terms of a very new Indian Hindu middle class in that sense of the term.
Very
So
fair.
your presentation just made me think, therefore, that the hegemonic status quo as if has to be reinforced, it has to be maintained, whether you come from minority educational institutions or even in case of public, which are non-minority higher education institutions. We've seen the interactional dynamics within public in my own research, within public higher education institutions being extremely problematic in terms of the moment, the students from the marginalized groups want to display their identities, whether it be caste, whether it be sexuality, they face a lot of problems of that way. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
4 minutes, I'm afraid.
Okay. No, thank you. That was really helpful. So the interviews that I'll address the question on placement first. The interviews that I conducted were with final year master's students, or final year, or in the last leg of their higher education degree, which was either master's or doctoral students. So they were definitely a lot, particularly in the PhD cases, a lot of them had qualified their NET, which is why they were eligible for scholarships. So they were definitely exploring teaching options, but they were not being able to break into these spaces. In fact, a lot of the people were said that, when they come from Muslim minority educational institutions, they are said ki, aap wapas kyun nahi chale jate? Why don't you go to your institution? Aapke yahan vacancy nahi hai. Is there no vacancy in your place? So, they talked about comments like that. And then in terms of absolutely concealment is something that I remember one of the interviews which has stayed with me, which I don't know, for some reason I didn't mention in the slide. On concealment, the student said that he won the Maulana Azad National Fellowship, which is a JRF, and that how in the API scorecard, in the actual recruitment form, he removed that because a net cleared person gets a certain number of marks, but MANF is not considered a JRF, so you don't get the additional 3 marks. So he said that, but the moment I would write MANF, it never got me marks, but it would clearly signal to them that I belong to a minority. So, and that would preclude me from possibilities. So I just removed that from my CV. So I think definitely I agree with the point on concealment. And there's a lot of anger and frustration that students feel on this. Like one of the girls mentioned to me that this is like traveling in a metro where, the ladies' compartment does not mean that the rest of the compartments ladies cannot access them, right? So it's the same with minority educational institutions. Just because they exist doesn't mean that they are solely responsible for addressing the educational needs of Muslims, which is not even possible given the numbers. So no, in entirety, I agree with the points that you've mentioned and the leads that you've given.
And with that, I'm
Thank
afraid-
you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Great questions. It's great to have you all as ever. We will have another CG webinar next Tuesday, looking at standing on the shoulders of students. Please come back and please join us again. And if you'd like to do a webinar, please get in touch as well. And we're always keen to have more presentations, particularly from South Asia and from Africa. Thank you all in the room as well. You can
Thank
stay
you.
and carry on. Thanks again. For coming.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.